Hi, and welcome to Unit 2, Lecture 5. I had to think about that for a second. In this unit, we're going to talk about succession. Or in this lecture, I'm sorry. Learning objectives. Explain how communities change over time, and explain how communities recover after a disturbance. Ecological succession is a thing that scientists have identified is that there's a more or less, it's a series of predictable events, predictable species that come and colonize and take over and change a community over time. So in this image, you've got this picture of basically just rock, okay? And over the course of time, many, many years, it could become a forest. And succession is just that pattern scientists have identified in many environments. Now, there are two types of succession. The first one is primary succession. So, primary succession is the succession that happens when there is nothing left. Basically, you're starting with rock. Okay, there's no soil. There's nothing left over. It basically has to start from scratch. So this rock has to then be broken down and allow the grasses to grow. Once those grasses are allowed to grow, they continue to break down the rock and turn it into soil that allow bushes to grow, and then those bushes end up creating an environment that allows the whole big forest. And you can see it can take decades for some of these communities to go through succession, especially when we're starting with nothing. A lot of times we'll see primary succession after a volcanic eruption. Okay, usually that's a big one, all right, because then the lava ends up creating the rock that now has to be broken down and turned into soil again. So when we have primary succession, we end up starting with this rock here, all right? And what ultimately happens is we need to get the first species. The first species is called a pioneer species. And often the pioneer species is a lichen. Now, a lichen is a kind of, it's a weird combination because it's a lot of time it's an algae working with a fungus. Okay, and what they're doing is they're actually chemically breaking down the rock, and as they chemically break down the rock, they're turning it into soil to make it available for the plants. This is what a pioneer species is. So a pioneer species is the first species to colonize the barren areas, and like I said, 99% of the time it's a lichen. Secondary succession is a little bit different. So you see in this picture, succession is when, or secondary succession is when we start with something that's left from an existing community. So one of my research projects when I was in college was to actually study the succession, or actually get a baseline. I got the baseline. Scientists after me were studying the succession, but of what was going to happen to a Christmas tree farm. So it had been maintained as a Christmas tree farm for years, for decades. Then the family ultimately no longer wanted to have it, and we were going to basically turn it back into a natural habitat and see what happened. So I took baseline readings of what was there. Okay, and so there's already stuff there. There's already some trees, some soils. This a lot of times happens with old farmland, okay, that was farmed, and we end up turning it back into wild spaces or whatever. And so what happens is it's not rock. There's some stuff there. It's just allowed to return to its natural state, or just let nature take its course. Generally, it doesn't take as long for secondary succession to happen as primary succession, because obviously you're not trying to start from scratch. You're not breaking down rock, okay? But it still takes time. A lot of times this happens after a forest fire, and like I said, after farming, when we're returning land and putting it back to normal. So you can see there's a difference in that time there. And last but not least, a climax community. A climax community is the quote-unquote end of succession. This is where we see the big forests with all the big trees, and all of that kind of stuff. However, what we're starting to notice is that climax communities are not necessarily always stable, which is something that scientists are grappling with right now, because species are always in flux. Nature is always in flux. Something is always causing it to kind of shift a little bit one way or the other. And that's no different for what's quote unquote a climax community. So it's the end, but it's a dynamic end. It's not, that's the species that are there and it's done. Okay, there's also other things that will come and go and move around and so on and so forth. So this one was pretty short. All right, I will talk to you later. Have a great night.